Hello, everyone. Today we are lucky to have a very special guest. We are joined today by Andrea Brocklebank, CEO of Canadian Cattle Association. Welcome, Andrea, and thank you very much for taking the time to chat today.
Thank you.
To start us off, could you please share a bit about your background and the journey that led you to the role of CEO at the CCA?
Yeah, so I was born and raised southwest of Calgary, west of High River, Alberta, on a mixed farming operation. We had cow calf and crops. I knew I always wanted to be in agriculture, so I decided to go off to school and did a bachelor's degree in agriculture economics at Lethbridge, and then a graduate degree at University of Saskatchewan in agriculture economics. When I left there, I worked in the banking and feedlot sectors throughout my university years, and I was interested in the cattle industry. I've always loved the cattle industry, and I did my thesis was on supply chains in the cattle industry, so I decided to reach out to the Canadian Cattle Association. It was 2004, so the height of the BSE crisis, and I got a job managing some project funds for them, and long story short, 21 years later, that job has evolved from I moved into managing the Beef Cow Research Council. At that point, it was just a half-time position. It was me, and I was able to grow the BCRC to, where it is today, where we really added the mandate of extension and with a lot of provincial engagement on demonstrating the value of research investments, we were able to increase our project portfolio. When I started, we probably funded about three research projects a year, whereas I think, the BCRC project inventory has grown to over 100 projects that they're funding at any one point in time. And so, uh, really liked what I was able to do at the Beef Cow Research Council. And when the CCA CEO job came up, I decided to put my hat in the ring. I see all of the important work done at the Canadian Cattle Association related to policy and all of the operational divisions that we have, and just wanted to make sure that we could continue that moving forward and saw the opportunity to expand what I'd done on the research side into policy and all of the other areas. hmm
Excellent. So you mentioned your time with the BCRC, and
hmm
obviously the CCA has a much broader scope. How do you think your role and time with the BCRC will influence and affect your role with CCA?
Um, Science has always underpinned what CCA's approach to policy has been. We've really, like, there's always been a focus on science-based policy, but also how we work with our public and stakeholder engagement division, and even with the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and that interconnection of all of the groups related to policy and sustainable beef and our public's groups, I think, has been strong, and I just look to continue that. Not gonna lie, I've always advocated for research funding and infrastructure and those types of things, and I think I'm gonna continue to hold that close to my heart at CCA and make sure it's done. It's an interesting timing because I moved into the role right around the same time as Ag Canada announced massive research cuts, which was very unfortunate and something we're continuing to navigate. So, my goal, BCRC is very much focused on the funding and implementation side. They actually can't lobby based on the rules around checkoff. And so I think that's CCA's role to make sure that we're advocating on behalf of the industry as to, stability of not just research investments, but making sure we have research infrastructure and capacity moving forward. And if Ag Canada proceeds as intended, I think one of our key messages at this point is the fact that we need to make sure that there's adequate programming funding and capacities for our universities to fill those gaps. And right now, most universities are already challenged with funding, and so they can't do that based on existing budgets. It would have to look at new funding. hmm
Yeah, that's a great point, and very challenging and interesting times in the research landscape. So hopefully with some advocating, not lobbying from yourself and CCA, there's some additional supports to help bridge that gap or maybe reverse course here.
Hmm.
So with that, what are your priorities in this role? And more generally, what do you view as the major priorities for Canadian industry right now?
Um, Depends on the day you talk to me right now, but we are always going to have the same thematic priorities when it comes to policy related work, and it falls under what our committees are. I mean, trade, we export 50% of what we produce, and trade is a big one, and we're working on two areas right now. One is the renegotiation of our largest trading agreement with the Canada, US, Mexico Free Trade Agreement, and then also concerns about cheap imports coming in through Mercosur and uninhibited trade, which is a concern in that dynamic. That being said, we're looking at the renewal of the next 5-year funding framework with the federal and provincial governments, and that's a big deal across everything from research to business risk management programs for producers to access, and overall funding for programs. And so, that one just continues to be something we're just making sure we're at the table and communicating on what works and what doesn't. And we work really closely with the provinces on that. The other two areas that just never, there's always things related is animal health, our files there. And obviously the big one in the last year has been traceability and discussions on how our industry moves forward. And, we're making sure it's very clear that we're working with producers on that and our provincial stakeholders to develop a plan as to what industry is comfortable with. Um, and there's also areas like environment where we just need to continue to move forward. We've made a lot of inroads in terms of building public trust, and that's partially through science and demonstrating the positive impacts we can have on the environment and also how we're mitigating those negative impacts. So, you know, that sounds like a big list of priorities, but there's a big team involved to make sure to deliver them. And my job is to really just make sure that we're navigating through those. With that being said, CCA, I stepped in at a time where we're also going through a big transition in our structure, based on our provincial membership asking for change. The CCA structure has not changed for over several decades, really, in terms of how we approach member representation in those issues. So we're also working on that as we speak, and I would say it's going positively in the sense that all of the provinces have agreed in principle to a plan, but we just need to now get that governance laid out and the structure done. So
So you hit the ground running, really.
I did.
Oh,
Yeah.
excellent. Okay, so in our world, in Livestock Gentec's world, we see obviously research and innovation as a priority, and
Hmm.
specifically our focus and bias is towards genomic tools, and we see those kind of keys to improve productivity in the beef industry. So, how do you see science and technology shaping the future of the beef industry?
Mm. Well, I mean, I've used the line, and I know our BCRC team does, is there's no silver bullets to the challenges in front of us, but it's about constant incremental improvements and changes. And that's where we really need to approach it from all different levels. We need to increase productivity, which is the biggest one. Our land base for cattle production or agriculture production isn't increasing. In fact, it's decreasing. And so it's always about the focus of producing more per acre and more per animal. And I think genomics is one of those tools that has a valuable opportunity to help with that, alongside all of the other areas of research, including, increasing forage productivity, yields, those types of things. And so from my perspective, it's just imperative that we continue on all fronts in innovation and research, and but also then making sure it actually gets adoption, which is a big part of what the BCRC really focused on, is getting information to producers so they can make decisions. Because we've seen that too, where producers have moved away from cattle production in the past when crops were more profitable. Obviously, we're in a bit different dynamic now with very strong cattle prices, but we want to make sure producers feel like they can grow, sustainably and for the long term, not just be in the short term market opportunities. So that's where I think I see huge opportunities to continue to improve our herd, not just from the animal side, but also the forage and feed side is a big area as well. Mhm.
Yeah, excellent. Maybe on a little bit more of the low tech side, you're
Hmm.
probably familiar with the saying, you can't manage what you don't measure. But in our
Hmm.
experience, our projects working with producers on adopting some of this technology,
Hmm.
we're finding producers still struggle with, record keeping as some of the basics.
Yeah.
How important do you think that is to improving productivity? And then is there
Hmm.
also a role for technology to help support producers in that data collection aspect?
Absolutely. I mean, BCRC has several modules, courses, information sheets on record keeping, and I think there's a bit of what we've heard from producers in the past is they tend to lean to, well, I have to have a perfect system, and it's like no, and I think that the keeping it simple actually applies in this case. And so even we've tried to really focus through the BCRC in the past in terms of what are the key records you need to keep to actually help your decision making processes. So not having a perfect system, but perhaps it's, the top 4 or 5 things you need to track and monitor, and encouraging producers to start small and simple. They can grow from there. But then in terms of technology, I think AI is proving its potential. I never thought I'd be using it, but I'm using it on the regular for different purposes and testing it out. But I think again, sometimes producers view that if they don't have a certain, software or something, and Excel spreadsheets work for a lot of this if they want to start small. So we really, I think, have recognized we need to meet the producer where they're at and make sure they're comfortable with what they're tracking and that it's sustainable. Because you can develop a fancy spreadsheet, but if you don't populate it regularly, you're back at square one. So yeah, I would just encourage. There's a lot of resources on beefresearch.ca that I know have been helpful even in our own operation. One of the things I always recognize, especially on our cow-calf side, is a lot of farm operators also work off farm. And so we have to be honest about what time they have available and make sure that it's focused on things that have meaningful impact for them on farm.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad you mentioned the BCRC and their efforts towards knowledge transfer, the resources available. So that kind of
Mhm.
leads right into the next question about just bridging the gap between research outcomes and on-farm adoption. So that's always a challenge. How do you
Mhm.
think we can continue to improve that and actually speed it up? And then who
Mhm.
are the key players in that world?
Yeah. I'm not the best one to speak on this. BCRC definitely would be in terms of they spend a lot of time thinking about not just what the great materials are, but actually looking at analytics in terms of what resonates with producers and what the uptake is of various things. And that's really helped them target in terms of where they produce more information or different approaches. One of the lessons Tracy, who's now the interim executive director of BCRC, taught me was, you have to hit producers multiple ways and multiple times to actually, ensure that they're willing to consider it, because there's a decision making process, right? They think about it for a while, and then if they see it again, they probably contemplate and dig a bit deeper. They probably then talk to some neighbors, and then they look at implementation. Um, so with that, it's making sure that there's resources all the way along that continuum available to them. And one of the things that my background really brought to BCRC was the economics piece, but it's great to have the science, and producers often will believe in a technology, but if they aren't sure about the economics and the impact and what the payoff timeline is on their operation, that's often where they'll stop. And so some of the simple decision-making calculators that BCRC has, or even some of the provinces have, I think are really important to help producers. I mean, they're not perfect and they're not attuned to every operation, but they give at least a framework for producers to consider what the costs and time and impact and payout is of these technologies moving forward.
That's great. Do you, just as a follow-up, do you see a lot of uptake from those calculators from the metrics you can see?
We do. I don't have the metrics. That would be a BCRC specific question, but I know we have, and I know in the past where we've seen lower use, we've realized that sometimes we need to alter them. So some of the calculators have gone through refreshes at points in time. some are used more than others too, and I think that just shows where producers are trying to key in on different decisions. So, but for sure, no, they've been quite helpful in just giving producers that additional look at approaching different technologies and investments in their operations.
Great. So change gears a little bit.
Hmm.
You've mentioned that improved productivity is always going to be number one priority.
Hmm.
However, sustainability seems to be a growing focus in policymakers, consumers, the international market, and researchers. So, could you speak briefly to how the Canadian beef industry is positioning itself in that conversation?
Yeah. Um, I think we honestly, when I back in 2010, I want to say we did not invest substantially in those areas of research. Environment was viewed to be a public good, and therefore, the government should do that work. And industry really, we had limited dollars, so we didn't spend a lot. And I think with growing questions around public trust and sustainability, we started to we did the first environmental footprint of beef production to be able to show what the improvements had been over the last 30 years. Um, and really have better understanding of our role and contributions to things like carbon sequestration and biodiversity. We also recognized we needed science around things like animal welfare and big questions like animal transport, because if there's not science, when policy comes up, it's not, it needs to be informed on science if we're going to have a productive and sustainable industry. And so, I think we over the last few decades have grown to understand that yes, we're going to fund productivity work, but industry also needs to look and make sure there's science to inform some of these discussions related to public trust and policy that ultimately a lot of them circle around things like sustainability and animal welfare in those areas. To the point that we renewed the environmental footprint of Canadian beef production. That was done again and is being done on a 5-year basis now. And really trying to strategically invest more research in certain areas like biodiversity and understanding of the importance of grasslands. That being said, one of the things I think BCRC quickly realized once we kind of had the baseline or the benchmarks for that work was let's not just fund that work separately. But if we're doing grassland research or forage productivity research and we can take those measurements, or we're doing cattle research and we can take methane measurements, let's do it within existing projects. It's much more efficient and cheaper, and allows us to have that data not only to increase productivity, but then to inform the public policy and public trust spaces as well. So we've tried to do it in a much more efficient approach. And really, I think that also makes producers, I mean, ultimately, we're funded through producer-based funding. And, as much as I think they recognize the value, they want us to focus on the things that help them on their operations. And so if you can say, well, we're increasing productivity, but also taking these other measures at the same time, that makes them feel a lot more comfortable in terms of their investments.
Yeah, so you touched on one of my next questions here. It seems like there's a lot of skepticism in producers and sustainability, or at least climate change isn't a major priority among producers. But the conversation at a policy level, I think, misses some of the key points. So biodiversity, the sequestration around pasture land, pasture grazing, other things like the half-life of atmospheric half-life of
Hmm.
methane. So other than the science, what can the industry and groups like the CCA and BCRC
Hmm.
do to evolve those conversations and support buy-in from the producers?
Yeah. That actually speaks to, when I started, we had the CCA from the policy side, and we had Beef Cow Research Council as a division. We had other divisions as well, but two divisions that have emerged in the last decade, a bit longer probably, for the Canadian Roundtables for Sustainable Beef and public and stakeholder engagement. And in both those cases, the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef was really about bringing together end users who had those questions around sustainability, and end users, restaurants, suppliers, banks, processors, um, to work together with producers to develop sustainability metrics that actually work and meet kind of have those conversations such that it wasn't a top-down strategy or a pushback strategy from industry. And I think that's been very positive. Likewise, public and stakeholder engagement has been really focused on moving from a very reactive approach where we were reacting to comments or decisions in the marketplace or policy um, to putting information out there. And I think what you've seen is a very changed conversation, honestly, where, it's not just beef, it's bad because of emissions, but there is also a role we play in terms of maintaining critical landscapes that can't be used for crop production and should be maintained and contribute to biodiversity. And so a lot of that is also meeting people where they're at and I'll say our public and stakeholder engagement team has done really well in terms of we're not going to tell people that they're wrong. We're just going to provide them information as to especially those consumers who just have questions and want to understand things more. They're not from an ag background and we've done that directly through different strategies, but also through influencers that want to learn about beef production. And I think it's helped a lot in terms of just being more proactive and putting information out there from a source. And yes, it's an industry-based source, but there's still receptiveness to it. So,
Yeah, I really like that. The meeting people where they're at and just sharing the information so folks can
mhm.
make decisions for
Yeah,
themselves.
yeah.
So just as a final question here, we've covered a little bit on national industry priorities, innovation, and the environment. For a research adoption group like Livestock Gentec, what do you see as critical areas to ensure we have the largest positive impact on the beef industry going forward?
Good question. I think this isn't simple, I know this, but I think collaboration across research teams is so important with limited resources and limited capacity, and making sure that we're sharing knowledge as we develop new technologies and innovations. And then collaborations with producers, whether that's through producer groups or directly through producers who want to be engaged. So there's understanding of what's practical and feasible on farm, where it makes sense, and to help that adoption continuum. And last but not least, I think groups like Gentech, I mean, genomics is probably one of the most complex areas that producers struggle to understand. And so making it tangible and bite-sized pieces that they can look at how they adopt and implement is I think really important, because when again meeting people where they're at, when you're overwhelmed, really busy, and something complex is in front of you and it's going to take a lot of time and understanding, you're much more likely to set it aside than if we can create understanding and build learning and work with them kind of to move forward incrementally.
Yeah, that simplicity, I think, is one of the keys, not just in livestock, but generally for technology adoption. It has to be usable, has to provide value.
Yeah,
Okay, great. Well, we really appreciate your time, Andrea. I know you're very busy, so thanks for taking the time this morning and best of luck.
thank you. It was great to visit with you today.
Take care. Bye.
Okay, thanks.